It's time for Security Now. What does Hedy Lamarr have to do with security? We'll talk about that and a whole lot more. Steve Gibson is next on Security Now.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Audio bandwidth for Security Now is provided by Winamp for Android, the ultimate media player for your desktop and Android device, featuring wireless sync. Download it free at winamp.com/Android. Video bandwidth for Security Now is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com. This is Security Now with Steve Gibson, episode 284, recorded January 19th, 2011. Your questions, Steve's answers, number 109. Security Now is brought to you by Astaro, the ultimate in unified threat management. For an Astaro demo in your office, visit astaro.com or call 877-4-ASTARO. And by MailRoute. MailRoute is a secure, hosted service that filters viruses and spam for companies of any size. To try it, or to save 10% for the life of your account, visit mailroute.info. It's time for Security Now, the show that covers your security and privacy online. And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, the man in charge, the key keeper, Gozer, the key master. No, Steve Gibson. Of GRC.com, the Gibson Research Corporation, the creator of Spinrite, the man who discovered the first spyware, named it spyware, and created the first spyware fighter, a task which he has handed off, of course, to many other companies since. Hey, Steve, how are you today?
Hey, Leo. Great to be with you again, as always.
Q&A today.
Yes, our 109th Q&A for episode 284. And not much has happened. Happily.
Yeah, that's always good news. No news is good news in the security world. Exactly.
I'm never complaining when that's the case. We have, the other culprits, we had Microsoft, of course, with their second Tuesday, Patch Tuesday, as it's become known, last week. But Adobe and, I imagine Google's Chrome browser is probably continuing to sneak forward and just keep itself updated in a stealthy fashion as they have designed it. But we've got a little bit of news and some errata, and then 10 great questions and comments and thoughts from our listeners.
We should remind people that every other show we do a Q&A, and you can always leave your questions for Steve at grc.com/feedback. And
yep.
that's where you got the questions for today. Steve culls the questions. We'll get to those in a second, but what's happening in the there is some security news.
There is a little bit of news. I chuckled to myself because our listeners may remember that last week on our podcast, I made the claim or the statement that given what was still coming out about the Stuxnet worm, which was believed to have been designed specifically to go after Iran's nuclear enrichment program, when I learned that it was masking its presence by sending back information to the monitoring systems indicating that the systems were still running that the centrifuges were still running at the specified and correct speeds, when in fact it was screwing around with them to make them run faster so they would damage themselves, I said, okay, if this is all the case, there's no way that this wasn't tested extensively beforehand by someone who had access to exactly this equipment. That is, you could not theoretically design this software just from specs and not put it through extensive testing. So what I got a kick out of was the front page story of the New York Times Sunday said that Israel and the U.S., and it named the locations where exactly this equipment was set up and used for developing and testing the operation of the Stuxnet worm.
They had the centrifuges. They had this. It was exactly what you posited 2 weeks ago.
Right.
In fact, somebody sent me an email saying, well, the Times finally caught on. So, well done, Steve. You predicted it.
You just couldn't design something that was going to be that was this specific to this hardware without having like a lab set up that had exactly, a prototype of what existed in Iran had to be somewhere else. And I noted that John Markoff was among the reporters that was in this, and of course he's been with the industry for a long time.
He's the most technically sophisticated reporter in the business. Mainstream reporter in the business, I would guess.
Then I got a kick out of another little bit of news, and that is that on June 8th, which happens to be a Wednesday, so we'll be recording a podcast on June 8th, is the first global scale IPv6 trial date.
Yay, we can be there. It'll be like the Y2K, right?
Well, and what I noted was it's like, wait a minute, we're running out of addresses in November.
Yeah, they're not getting on it that quickly. Exactly. We're going to have apocalypse November, right? I mean, it's just going to melt down, right?
Well, actually, one of the questions that we'll be getting to in the later on in this podcast is what exactly is it that's going to happen when we run out?
Good.
And so we'll talk about we'll talk about this. But so what's happening on June 8th is that Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Akamai, and Limelight are at least those 5 services are going to be making their facilities available over IPv6. Now, actually, Google has had search on IPv6 for quite a while. You could, if you have an IPv6 address, you could go to ipv6.google.com and come into Google through IPv6. So they've already been there. But the idea is that for 24 hours on June 8th, all of those services will be available specifically through IPv6. And again, while that's good, I mean, this should have been like a year ago. And so it's like, well, okay, I guess, I mean, that it's like, well, let's see, June, July, August, September, October, November. I mean, we're guessing November time frame for running out of this. And I saw someone trying to explain to someone who didn't get it what IPv4 depletion was. And I had tried to describe it myself to some friends not long ago. And someone said, well, just imagine like the phone system running out of phone numbers.
Which you kind of did. Remember we got all those new area codes? That's what happened.
Exactly. The original structure, it used to be, for example, that an area code, the center digit was either a 0 or a 1, which is why we had 714, 405, 213.
And the bigger metros had a 1 because it was faster to dial a 1 than it was a 0 on the dials. It would go.
And the primitive, the primitive electromechanical dialing systems, they used that key of whether the center digit of 3 was a 0 or a 1 to determine whether it was an area code, because none of the prefixes had that. And so that allowed them to disambiguate those two things. But the other place where we ran out, remember the 800 numbers. It used to be that toll-free numbers were only 800 and then something. Well, they did run out of 800 numbers and then had to add 818 and a few others.
888, yeah.
So we've sort of seen that before. But anyway, so we'll talk about the consequence of that later in the show. But I did sort of think, yes, well, it's good that we're having a global scale trial of IPv6 this summer, but it does seem a little bit late for relative to.
Well, I can't wait. So in a little later on in the show, we're going to find out what that means, what the consequences would be in November or whenever this runs out.
And then another very good piece of news. Apparently, there has been pressure from the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, the U.S. FTC, and others about the fact that Flash is being so pervasively used to store tracking data in the so-called LSO, the local storage objects, which Flash supports. And we've talked about the fact that there are companies that specialize in reconstituting deleted browser cookies from the so-called Flash cookies, which are these LSOs, and that there's no obvious or simple user interface for Flash. Flash is a browser plugin, so it's sort of transparent. You go to a site that's using Flash, and things happen, ads jump around. In fact, their whole website could be Flash based, as is the case in some cases where, but Flash itself doesn't have a user interface. It's just meant to be used as a plugin. So what Adobe has done, and I'm led to believe that Chrome, within several weeks, will be the first to have a UI for it. Adobe has published an API, an application programming interface, for access to their local storage objects for the sake of allowing them to be deleted by browsers, which could be providing a user interface to that. Chrome apparently being the first. But Mozilla, Google, and Adobe, Mozilla, Google, and Apple teamed up with Adobe to do this. So I would imagine that Firefox will offer the same sort of thing very quickly, since they were part there, and presumably Apple with their Safari browser. So that's just good news. That gives users the ability to do this. The reason browsers are involved at all is that browsers are essentially presenting this facility through Flash to the user. So it does make sense that since browsers have a mature user interface of controls and settings and toolbars and so forth, why not allow the object which is instantiating the Flash object, which is the browser, to also give it the control that it otherwise lacks. So that's good news. We'll keep an eye on that, and as announcements of browsers that are supporting this LSO deletion occur, I'll let our listeners know.
Very good.
I've been a user of the eBay and PayPal dongle, which we talked about quite a while ago, ever since we talked about it. You know, it's the little football, as we've often referred to it, which you press the button and you get a six-digit code, which you then enter into, for example, PayPal, when you're logging into PayPal to authenticate yourself. It's a one-time password approach that gives multi-factor authentication. But the problem is, being a physical token, if you ever want to, for example, in my case, purchase something on eBay or through PayPal, when it's not with you, that's a problem. Just the other day, I decided, I was like browsing around and noted that VeriSign, which is the source of these things, supported a BlackBerry client. So I added it to my BlackBerry and was very pleased and impressed with how simple this is, and essentially how functional it is. Essentially, and this is now available for many of the different smartphones. I didn't think ahead to check to see if it's Android
I think
and iPhone.
I think both.
But I know it's, yes.
Yeah.
And so essentially, when I run this on my BlackBerry, run the little app, it comes up and shows me the serial number for this instance, which is unique, of this instance of this little authentication app that I'm running, and a 6-digit code, and also shows me a little expiration timer, which counts down from 30 seconds. And every 30 seconds, it changes this number. And so they show me that so that I'm able to see whether I have time to type it in before that expires. And I simply registered the serial number that was presented on the screen with PayPal, telling them, oh, look, I have a second authentication dongle now, and now I'm able to to do the same level of multi-factor, one-time password style authentication wherever I am, because I've always got my BlackBerry with me when I'm out roaming around. So
yeah, I think that's better than a dongle. I really do, because people have their phones all the time. I really like doing it that way.
Yes, I think it's terrific. And in fact, now I'm back having to tell PayPal which of the two objects I'm using, which is annoying because it makes me go through that step.
Right.
Whereas when I only had one of them, it knew which one I had, and that allowed me to just add that 6-character or the 6-digit passcode to after my password in one phase. So I'm now seriously considering deregistering my football and always using my BlackBerry. So I wanted to let our users know that this has all actually really happened, because I know when we talked about the football originally, there was a huge amount of interest in it as a opportunity for increasing security, and that now that VeriSign has pushed all these little clients out to smartphones, as you say, Leo, it's just a terrific solution.
Yeah. Yeah, it is on my Android, I believe, and I believe I saw an iPhone app, so I think it's everywhere. I mean, it would only make sense. If they're going to put it on BlackBerry, they're going to put it on iPhone and Android.
Right, probably first,
yeah,
in fact.
Exactly.
So finally, in an errata, I got a note from someone who didn't disclose his full name. He called himself Ken F. He's a cybersecurity manager with an undisclosed government agency. And he said, Steve, a huge fan of TNO, which of course is my acronym for Trust No One, and been listening for the past 2 years to Security Now. A few episodes ago, you were discussing the exfiltration of the data from the government's classified networks relating to WikiLeaks. I wanted to provide you the correct pronunciation of that classified network. I was calling it Cypernet, S-I-P-R-N-E-T. And he sort of breaks it up phonetically, and he says it's pronounced SIP, S-I-P hyphen P-E-R hyphen N-E-T.
Cypernet.
So Cypernet.
Yeah.
He says, thank you for all your stellar work in this field, along with breaking down the many complex issues to usable and understandable chunks. Ken F., cybersecurity manager from an undisclosed government agency. So,
I love that.
Cypernet.
Cypernet.
Now we know. And I did have a short little note from another listener of ours, Tom Leonard, who said he wanted to drop a note to let me know about Spinrite. He said, I just recently purchased it as I provide computer tech support for the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology in Rapid City, South Dakota.
I always loved that name. It sounds so 19th century. Mines and Technology.
Yeah, South City School of Mines and Technology. Great? He says, I found out about, well, it's sort of like 3M, you know, the well-known 3M Corporation.
Was it Minnesota Mining and Milling?
Manufacturing.
Manufacturing, yeah.
Yeah, that's what 3M actually stands for. It's like, okay, good thing they shortened it. Anyway,
and you know, KFC stands for Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Right.
They didn't like the fried part anymore. Yeah.
I found out about your product from watching you and Leo on the Twit network, which is what's happening right now, specifically your Security Now segment. I truly missed Leo and his time he spent on the screensavers and call for help. But now I think he's found his niche and is truly the best for us geeks. Anyways, on to my story. I purchased your product about 6 weeks ago and thought, when am I going to try this out? Well, this morning, I went to boot my personal netbook, and the blue screen of death shows up. Well, since there's no floppy or CD drive, I had to create a bootable USB flash drive. The first flash drive I tried wouldn't boot. So I went to your FAQ page for Spinrite and found that some flash drives don't work properly. So I tried another flash drive. This one worked fine and booted right into Spinrite. I ran the recovery and repair level, number 2, I believe, and it started checking things. It got to about 7% and just seemed to stall, but it appeared to be continuing to work. It moved the files and sectors, declared one sector to be unrecoverable, but apparently recovered most of that sector's data. After about 4 hours total, it finished. I rebooted, and up came the computer. It now starts up and shuts down much faster. So this area of the disk must have been going bad for a while. Steve, thanks again for Spinrite, and I plan to keep on watching you on Twit with Leo. Thanks, Tom Leonard.
I think that's generally the case. A lot of people complain about their systems slowing down, and many times it's merely one or two bad sectors on the drive, which Windows spends a lot of time trying to read in order to boot or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. So moving stuff off of that one sector can make a huge difference.
And then Spinrite will remove that sector from use, and causing the drive to bring in a swap in a spare. Spinrite will then replace the data. And one of the things that Spinrite can uniquely do is, even if it's finally absolutely unable to recover every last bit of data, it will return as much of the 512 bytes as it was able to read, even if not all, and sometimes that makes a difference. It'll let you know that that's what it did, but for example, if that's a chunk of directory space, it may actually be that the part that it couldn't read wasn't necessary, but was just slowing things down.
Could have been slack space.
Even an unrecoverable sector, it's able to get most of it.
Right. Steve, we're going to get to your questions. We've got 10 good ones for you, including, and I'm very curious what happens in November with IPv4. But before we get to that, can I say hello to our friends at Astaro, the very first sponsor on the Twit Network, still with us. They were the first to sponsor Security Now, and I still am I just love them, and I'm really glad that they're still supporting this network. I think it's almost been 4 years now. Since maybe 5 since Astaro started advertising on Security Now. What is Astaro? Oh, I should tell you. They're a security company, and their chief product is the incredible Astaro Security Gateway. If you're in the business, you'll know what UTM is. It's Unified Threat Management. It's an appliance they plug into your network. It protects your corporate network from the outside world using best-in-class in open and commercial software to provide you with superior protection from spam, from viruses, from bad guys, and adds convenience features like VPN over SSL, intrusion protection, of course, full content filtering. You can control your users' P2P and IM access, an industrial-grade firewall with all the appropriate keywords like SPI and so forth. And it's all in a very easy-to-use, high-performance appliance, which will scale with your business. They have a very sophisticated, what they call it, active-active clustering, but basically it enables load distribution for up to 10 Astaro security gateways. As your business grows, you can grow with Astaro. That's patent-pending technology. They also do something I really love. They offer home user licenses for free. Full licenses with the full V7 Astaro and complete access to Astaro Up to Date, which is their automatic update feature. They do limit it to, I think, 10 IP addresses, 10 users, which is absolutely sufficient for home. But a great way to try Astaro. There's even a VMware appliance of Astaro, so you can try it. But you'll, if you get it for the business, you'll get the full unit hardware and all that software and the Astaro Up to Date and all of that stuff. You could try it. They'll give you a demo in your business. That's easy peasy. Just call 877 the number 4 ASTARO if you're in the U.S. Outside the U.S., visit astaro.com. They are a global company, and they have demos all over the world. But in the U.S., 1-877 the number 4 ASTARO. That's 877-427-8276. This is simply the best UTM out there, and I love the convenience features. The ability, for instance, to do automatic encryption, decryption, and signing of email, completely transparent to your users using SMIME or OpenPGP. And you can have groups of users, or you can group it. Individual users can have their own signatures. It's very sophisticated. SSL, VPN, using industry standards like IPsec, L2TP over IPsec, and PPTP tunneling. I don't want to drown you in buzzwords, but it's fully buzzword compliant. Let's put it that way. You try it out right now. 877 the number 4 ASTARO. And Astaro, thank you for being such long-term supporters of Security Now.
Yeah.
I'll have to check the calendar. I think it's been 5 years. It's amazing. In many ways, I owe Twit to Astaro because nobody would advertise on this network. until Astaro came along. And once Astaro showed that not only could it be done, but it works, then we got a few other sponsors after that.
Yeah.
Rob in Melbourne with our first question of the day. Are you ready, Stephen?
Absolutely.
He says, NoScript is already adding do not... I shouldn't do my Australian. It's terrible. And every time I do it, I get an email from somebody saying, hey, mate, we love the show, but don't try to talk Australian. Steve, just thought I'd drop you a line to tell you that NoScript seems to be adding headers to my HTTP queries regarding web tracking. Specifically, a header X do not track and X behavioral ad opt-out. Cheers from sunny Australia, Rob.
Well,
first of all, somebody has to abide by those headers, right?
Well, yes. You may notice that, I mean, I've asked for this. I mean, suggested that this would be a great solution for dealing with the problem with tracking. But this was the first I had heard that NoScript might be doing that.
But is this a standard? I mean, are these headers standard?
No.
No.
Well, but that's fine because we have a chicken and egg problem here. I mean, someone has to start doing this,
right?
So that these things exist. And so I fired up my packet capture, refreshed a Google search page that I had up, and sure enough, those two headers are being, ever since the 28th of December 2010. So not yet for a month. So this is, I think it was version 2.0.9 is when Giorgio added this to NoScript. And so I shot him a note saying, hey, this is fantastic. And we corresponded briefly about it. What he wrote on his posting was, he says, from now on, a web browser with NoScript installed warns every HTTP server it contacts that its user does not want to be tracked, i.e., that this data must not be collected for profiling and persistent identification purposes. I believe this is a safe assumption about the feelings of most, if not all, NoScript users. As stupid as it may sound, parens, why parties who are interested in tracking you would comply, close parens.
True. I mean, it's not in their interest.
Correct. A means to clearly express your will of not being tracked is going to be useful, especially when backed up by law or industry self-regulation, as explained here. Therefore, it seems in the interest of NoScript users and privacy-concerned netizens in general to participate in this effort. In its current release, NoScript allows the Do Not Track feature to be disabled or tweaked by opening about:config and editing the noscript.donottrack.star preferences. And so he's got three preferences where you can enable it, the whole system, or not, meaning that you could disable it if you just didn't want that to be added to your queries. Then you can list a set of URL patterns which are space separated of destinations, query destinations, which are not to be sent the do not track me message, or and then you can also, so that's called exceptions, where you can have exceptions to the add the do not track header, and then thirdly, you can force specific ones that do qualify to still be forced. And he says a graphical user interface, a GUI, for these options and possibly finer grain controls, for example, to allow some or all of the third-party trackers on certain websites only, will be added in future releases. So anyway, this is great. This is something, we know that, for example, do not track legislation is being considered. There's talks of this happening. I can't think of a better place, as I have said often before, than for our browsers to simply add a header that says, I do not want this query to be tracked, and it's here. So yes, it's true, no one obeys it yet, but we have to have it for anybody to obey it. So it would be great, for example, if Safari and Chrome and Opera and the other browsers and IE were to pick up on this and implement the same thing. Then it would be a simple matter of legislators saying, look, if somebody has this in their headers, you're not to track them.
Right.
And then, of course, sites would have then the ability to say, well, we really do need tracking in order to support ourselves. So then they would be able to present to the user a notification saying, whoa, you've tried to enter the site with tracking blocked. You're going to have to make an exception for us if you want our content, in which case the user could decide, don't need it that much, and vote by saying no thanks, or they'd say yes, and then again, Giorgio and other UI designers could make it simple to add allow tracking exception on a site-by-site basis. So if this all happens, we're beginning to get to where we want to be.
Another great reason to use NoScript.
Yes.
Just as a side note, I've seen these X headers in email. You can have an arbitrary X header in email, and whether it's the server sees it or not, or acts on it or not, is completely up to the server. I didn't realize you could also do the same thing with HTTP requests. It's the same mechanism, I guess.
Yes. The idea is that the X hyphen as the prefix says this is not part of the standard. So, for example, we have query headers, for example, like the expires or the referrer, the HTTP referrer header, and so any query does have headers which are part of the so-called metadata. There's not something that the user sees, but it's something that the browser is sending, and by in the spec it says non-spec specified headers, that is sort of optional headers, can be included just by sending X hyphen and then the header name. And in this case, what I saw in the packet capture was that they were the header :1 for X do not track, and the same thing for X behavioral add opt-out was a :1, so essentially saying true that I do not want to be tracked. So yes, exactly in analogous fashion, as you said, Leo, to email, this can be done. I know, for example, because I've done a lot of work over in NNTP, the Network News Transport Protocol, that news groups, for example, GRC's news groups use, has the same sort of facility, and I invented some headers for our own purposes that run in the same vein.
Yeah. Okay. Question 2, Jamie in England. I won't do an English accent either. Or a phony one anyway. Wonders about IPv4 doomsday. Steve, when you were recently talking about IP version 4 address depletion, you said that the day we run out of all IPv4 addresses would be doomsday. Well, how can this be the case? Surely all the equipment we already have on the net will be fine and continue to talk to each other. It's just that no one new will be able to join us. Am I correct? So it's only a mild concern, right? Could the new clients joining the net not simply go through an IPv4 proxy to talk to the rest of us? Thanks. Love the show. Keep up the good work. So what does it mean, IPv4 doomsday?
Okay, so
first of all, I guess we should say up front, just to set the stage, anybody who listens to the show, I'm sure knows that IPv4 dotted quad allows for, 2 billion addresses? 4 billion addresses.
4.3 billion different unique IPs.
Every computer that is on the internet has to have a unique public address, just like a unique phone number. And we're running out. We'll have gone through 4 billion addresses in November, roughly.
Right. Essentially, back when the internet was being designed, it's very much like the same story with RAM. Remember that, for example, the Apple IV allowed you the original Apple computer allowed you to have 64K of RAM, and we all knew no one would ever need more than that.
Plenty,
exactly. I mean, what could you possibly do with more than 64K? So So, this is not the first time we've ever run out of resources one way or the other. We tend to do this because the technology lives much longer than we expect. It ends up not being obsoleted as quickly as we expect. It just wants to grow forever. So back when the original designers established 32-bit addresses, even then they allocated them inefficiently. So there are big chunks of that 4.3 billion addresses which cannot be used. We talked about this several times in the past, so I won't go all the way through it. But we are, around the end of this year, running out of space. Now, if I ever said doomsday, then I'm not happy with myself for having declared it doomsday, because it's not doomsday, just exactly as Jamie in England asks. It is exactly like you suggested, Leo, if we ran out of phone numbers. Well, if we ran out of phone numbers, then people wanting new phone numbers would have a problem, because all the existing phone numbers would be in use, but the ones that were already there would still work. So the bad news is that the transition from IPv4 to IPv6 is going to be an incredible mess. There isn't an elegant way to do it. I think it's one of the reasons everyone are just dragging their feet as much as they are. The reason we're not even doing this full global test of only 5 large sites until summertime. It is a catastrophe of just, that everyone wishes and is hoping somehow we're not going to have to address. I mean, even for me, my entire infrastructure, grc.com's infrastructure, is all IPv4. Shields up. All the code that I've written, all of my packet management stuff, everything is 32-bit IPv4 addresses. And so the day that I have to bite the bullet and implement this as all IPv6, I'm not looking forward to. I mean, I can, because I wrote all this code. It's all raw, my own raw packet stuff, so there's nothing preventing me from manufacturing IPv6 packets, except I'm going to have to go off and write a whole bunch of code that I'm not looking forward to. So certainly on this podcast during 2011, as I have said before, 2011 is going to be the year that IPv6 really does happen. We will be talking about transitional things a lot. We'll be talking about the conversion from IPv4 to v6, proxying and natting and gateways. There are things like IPv4 tunneling, where you tunnel IPv6 content through IPv4 through network segments that aren't IPv6 aware, but they still can support tunneling. I mean, it's just going to be a real nightmare. So we'll have lots to talk about. Obviously we'll get there someday, because this IPv4 depletion really is going to be finally putting a lot of pressure on our ISPs and network engineers to start taking this very seriously. Everyone, including me, has been able to ignore it until now and wants to continue ignoring it as long as we possibly can, because it's just going to be, a lot of work without any feature change. Basically, it's not like we get any great new benefits from it. It's just a lot more address bits is essentially all that happens. So the world doesn't end, and I'm sure what we're going to see is IPv4 having a presence on the internet probably forever. I don't think it's ever going to go away. It'll just be, always there. I hope I get to keep all my IPv4 IP addresses, and IPv6 users will still be able to get to me that way. So And I already have had people asking, "Hey, when is Shields Up going to support IPv6?" And it's like, I don't know when, but
so is there a workaround if somebody wants? Okay, so in November we run out,
okay,
well,
so for
everybody
example,
has pools of numbers that aren't allocated. So your internet service provider probably has plenty of free numbers that they can allocate.
Yeah, look, for example, at cell phones. So you could argue that cell phones are probably a class of device that really doesn't care what its IP address is.
Right.
The user doesn't even know. There's no transparency to the end user about the IP address of a cell phone.
Right.
So that's a place where you could easily, a high growth place, because that's where lots of these, like Verizon is adding support for iPhones. And so that's a place where you could easily sort of transparently bring up IPv6 in a way that end users would not be made uncomfortable at all. And so, yeah, a place where you could have a huge increase in space.
Okay. I guess I won't worry about it.
It'll just happen.
I'll let you wise guys figure it out.
And we'll be talking about it all year long.
Yeah.
it's going
There'll be a
to
lot to
continue coming up. And in fact, what I'm planning to do when we do, as we will this year, as I promised, our from the ground up how the internet works, we'll have a huge chunk of new content which we've never discussed, which is IPv6, all the gory details and all the the transitioning nightmares that we're going to be going through.
Woohoo! Question 3, Tom Zaruka in the Detroit area brings up a good point about SSDs, encryption, and the trim command. Steve, if the whole disk is encrypted in such a way that every sector is marked used, it will increase wear and maybe slow things on SSDs since it will have to shuffle full blocks. If only the used sectors are encrypted, instead of the whole disk, then the trim command can work to erase blocks for the unused sectors. Windows 7 is, of course, the only OS that currently supports trim. This will make it faster, more reliable. By the way, I guess we should explain that there's a weird effect on SSDs that kind of is like fragmentation, and it slows the SSD down. I asked at CES, I talked to two of the guys responsible for Intel SSDs, and Intel is really the creme de la creme of solid-state hard drives. And we're talking about those flash-based hard drives. And I asked him about trim, and Windows 7 is the only OS that supports trim, and most of the controllers, except for the SandForce controller, maybe a couple of others, don't support trim anyway. So most hard drives don't support trim. And they said, well, what happens with most hard drives is there's this peak theoretical speed, there's a drop as you use it, and then it levels out and it pretty much stays there. All trim does is get it back. They actually, the two guys debated each other. One guy said, oh, it's important. The other guy said, it's not important in real world. So there is debate even whether you need trim. But now let's continue on with your answer. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just thought that was kind of interesting. They don't even agree.
That's great background, which I didn't have. I have the low-level technology side of it. So here's the deal. Tom's question is a good one, and it raises a very good point, because he's responding to my answering a question 2 weeks ago about the whole idea of full disk encryption on an SSD, where, and I think the question was, would that slow things down in the same way that fragmenting might on a hard drive? And I said, no, because once you were encrypted, the whole drive was encrypted, then you were just reading the same sectors from the SSD that you would otherwise. And this issue of trim means that I was incorrect 2 weeks ago because of the way SSDs work. So here's the deal. When you write a sector to an SSD, it must erase the contents due to the nature of the physics of the way an SSD drive works. It has to erase the sector before it can write it. The problem is that, again, due to the physics of SSDs, an SSD cannot erase a single sector. It is forced to architecturally erase a much larger block of sectors. Now, if the SSD knew, if it had a way of knowing that the other sectors in the block were not in use, did not have data in them, then it would not have to first read them and cache them inside itself, then modify the sector to be written, and then write them all back. Because again, we're trying to change or write to one sector. But to do that, we have to erase that sector, which means we have to erase the whole block that that sector is part of. And if we're going to erase the whole block, we have to first read the whole block, then erase the whole block, then write it all back. So you can see there's much more work being done if the other sectors in that block have valid data. What the trim command, and so I should also mention that in order to deal with this, in order to make SSDs functionally identical to hard drives, they manage all this internally. It's amazing. And you referred to the SSD controllers. Right. That's the job of the controller inside the SSD package, which does all of what I just said transparently. It maintains its own proprietary bitmap of every single sector in the space of the SSD and whether that sector has ever been written to. So as you write to sectors in the SSD, those little bits get set, telling it that that sector contains valid data. So over time, as you're writing to more and more of the SSD, more of these little bits are being set. But at the operating system level, you may be deleting files. When you delete files, as we know, we're only marking those sectors or clusters, because modern file systems allocate in cluster sizes, which is a cluster of sectors. We're marking those clusters as no longer in use. We know that the file system is not going out and actually erasing them, because that's how undelete utilities work, is they come back and say, well, let's get the data. If it hasn't been overwritten, we can recover the data that was deleted and the user regretted making that deletion. What trim support in the so file systems are marking areas deleted, but that information is not being given to the SSD. So as the evolution of the ATA, the AT attachment specification has progressed, the designers of SSDs wanted to provide a means by which the operating system using the drive could reset those little bits saying these sectors are in use. So that's what trim, T-R-I-M, command does. The trim command is an extension to the ATA, the AT attachment specification, providing a means for communicating to the drive that the following sectors are no longer contain valid data as far as the operating system is concerned. So when we say that only Windows 7 supports the trim command, we're meaning that only Windows 7 is a popular operating system in use, which when and as you delete files from the file system, the Windows 7 sends a batch of trim commands down to the SSD, telling it that those sectors are no longer in use. And so the beauty of that is that it prevents these bits, these little in-use bits, from just accumulating without end, which they otherwise would in the SSD, telling the SSD that as you've deleted files, those sectors are no longer in use. So getting back to Tom's exact question, he said, if you ran TrueCrypt, for example, to encrypt the entire drive, it would set every single one of those in-use bits in the SSD because you have written to every single sector of the drive in order to encrypt the whole thing. And he is exactly right. So what you'd really like to do is run whole disk encryption and then have a means for sending a full drive worth of trim commands telling the SSD reset all of your sector in use bits, which you're using to manage those blocks, back to zero, because even though we just wrote to the entire drive to encrypt it, we didn't store any valid data there yet. So
Okay.
There is a Linux utility called HDParam, which has that facility. There is some driver support. There's a utility that Intel has, an add-on utility where you can manually scan the file system, and it will look at the clusters that are in use and then issue trim commands for those that are not. But I've tried to purchase 2 SSD drives from Intel, which offers this support, and I failed both times, which is really annoying because I care about this kind of thing. So, and as you said, Leo, it's not even really clear that this is more than sort of a theoretical problem.
Right.
The controllers are doing a very good job of managing their SSDs. It's not like performance continues to descend forever until it becomes really, really slow. You do see a drop as these bits are being set, but then at some point, it's not such a big deal afterwards.
I asked Alan Malventano, who's the guy who discovered this and kind of publicized it on PCPer.com, and who's of course a regular on our both PCPer and Twitch podcasts. And I said, well, Alan, in order to create this benchmark and to show this, you had to really kind of create this synthetic, make a lot of small files, erase a lot of small files kind of a situation. So the question is not whether this happens, because you can demonstrate it. But the question is whether in real-world use it would be a significant degradation in performance. And even the Intel guys disagreed. That's what I liked about it. One guy said, oh, no, it's a problem. And it's completely moot unless you're using Windows 7, because no operating system except Windows 7 does it anyway.
Correct.
So unless your operating system does it, you're not going to. So it's really actually a kind of a angels dancing on the head of a pin argument, and yet I think it's fascinating, and it's certainly something that is relevant if you want to use an SSD. I'm using it on OS 10, so I've never noticed.
Right. And now all of our listeners understand what the whole trim thing is with SSDs.
Now they're in, man. They're in. They're with it. Jamie Hunt, England. Did you write this, or did he write Jamie Hunt in England, UK?
That's the way he wrote it.
Okay. I mean, I know they're not the same thing, but I just think it's funny. It's like saying in the United States, North America. Wonders about driver update scanning. Steve, there seem to be millions of sites scattered about the internet saying they will scan my PC for outdated drivers. Oy, Gavolt. Thanks, but no thanks. But 95% of these programs seem to be from an unreputable source, or at least a source with no reputation. My question to you is, do you recommend using a program that will scan for outdated drivers and tell me to update, sort of like Secunia PSI for drivers? And if so, which one? Thanks.
Well, You said it, Leo. I wouldn't say that 95% of them are unreputable. I would say 99.9.
It's basically giving them permission to see what you got.
Yeah, and okay. So here's the deal. It is so tempting to want to have the very latest drivers for your machine, but it makes me feel like I feel even more strongly about this than I do about the temptation not to always update to the latest software, because drivers are even providing less incremental functionality than new versions of software, and it's not clear that you get a lot when you update to a new version of software. So I guess what I'm saying is that my feeling is if some device on your system is not working, then certainly try updating the device driver and see if that fixes the problem. But if it's all working, then I don't know what you gain from updating drivers to the latest versions, hoping that they're going to work better, because drivers don't have that much ability, to sort of like only work part way. They're generally working or not. And so my feeling is, I've never done a scan through some third-party site to like have it look at all of my drivers.
It's a bad idea.
I really agree. I think it's a very bad idea. I know that I'm a Lenovo user, and the Lenovo system has for several years now, a facility for checking its own drivers versus its own database and notifying you if things have changed. And invariably, what I notice is it's trying to give me new versions of drivers for where the only difference is it now supports laptops I don't own. And so it's like, well, okay, why do I care about changing this driver to support a laptop that that Lenovo now offers that I don't own? So I look carefully at what the benefits are of updating a given driver. If it says, "Oh, we've made great strides in power management," it's like, "Oh, I need that." That
Right.
sounds like a good thing. But if it's, we now support 16 new laptops, it's like, okay, I don't think I'm going to be making the move for that reason. And again, I would stick with the source of my machine rather than some random site that says, let us scan your machine and let you know if there's something new.
Right.
Seems like a
Windows
bad
itself,
idea.
Windows itself actually does a pretty good job of keeping drivers up to date. They're not in the critical updates; they're in the optional updates. But that's what I do. I just run Windows Update, and I look and see if there's any driver updates, because I generally will use the ones provided by Microsoft, just because they're tested for Windows. They may not be the latest
known
always,
to be compatible.
but they're known good. Yeah. Yep. And I find that that's fine. It's funny how old habits die hard, and people who've been PC users for a long time have all sorts. Yeah, well, they have all sorts of things that they do that were, maybe needed, like defragging and, updating drivers, checking your video driver. And I think as we've gotten to be a more mature system, if you're using Windows 7, I think you probably can eliminate a lot of the stuff that we used to do to make. You don't have to edit your config.bat anymore.
And defrag your registry.
Yeah.
Pretty much, if you're using Windows 7, you've given up.
Yeah. Well, that's another matter. Yesterday I did Live with Regis and Kelly, and we taped a second segment that'll air in a couple of weeks. They're going to do a Twitter week all week long. And so I went up to Regis's office to tape this segment on teaching him how to use Twitter, which was fun. And he was using internet.
Oh, how fun. When is it going to air, Leo?
January 31st.
Okay, great.
I don't want to tip it, but it was really fun. And I think what's most interesting, yesterday he announced that he was leaving the show at the end of the summer, and which was a big shock to everyone. No one knew this. I didn't know it. None of the producers knew it. Everybody went, because they're all going, uh-oh, what do we do? Regis is
such a fun non-techie that I imagine
wonderful.
You guys must have just had a ball.
I adore him. First of all, he's 80 years old. He is sharp as a tack. I mean, there are very few 80-year-olds who are as quick and as with it and on top of it as he is. he's the law. I read this after he announced the retirement, which was breaking news everywhere. That he is currently the longest running on-air talent in the ever in the world. I mean, there's nobody been doing it longer than Regis Phil, but he started with Joey Bishop in the 60s or 50s, you know. So in any event, so it's a real honor, and I have always liked Regis. We hit it off very well, and so we're doing this thing, and after it's done, internet he's using IE, it crashes. It crashes on him, and he says, "What's this, Leo?" I said, "I don't know. We were just tweeting and it crashed." And Gelman goes, "God, I hate Internet Explorer." It's like, it's so sad that normal people have to go, huh? I was just tweeting. What happened? And it crashed the browser. I'm sure he's using, I didn't look, but I'm sure he was using like XP with IE6, but I didn't really even want to know. It was like, I just stepped back and said, I guess we're done. I don't think that will make it into the tape, by the way. Charles Victorian in Houston, Texas, our next question. Actually, it's a long one. Before I get to that, I would like to just briefly mention, and I will do this quickly because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do want you to know about mail route, because it's how I avoid spam. You know, Dvorak was famous for saying, I get no spam. I can't say I get no spam, but I have to say I get very little spam, and that's for the last 6 years, since 2004, when I had my server. I have my own leoville.com server that I have all my email go through. When I pointed my MX record to MailRoute, and I started doing that in 2004, it's unbelievable, the amount of spam. I'll give you some numbers. Tom Johnson, the guy who wrote it, I asked him, I said, Tom, tell me what are my numbers for the last 12 months? He said, in the last 12 months, you've roughly 1 million emails going to leoville.com. Oh, there's many, many addresses there. Of that million, all but 30,000 were spam. And we stopped them. You never saw them. They never went to your server. That's 970,000 messages that I would have used bandwidth for. I would have stored. I would have had to review. Maybe I'd have another spam solution that would have gotten rid of them so I didn't have to see them. But still, that's a lot of bandwidth that would have consumed. MailRoute saved me money as well as time, as well as eliminating all those Viagra ads I never did really want to see. If you have your own server, if you're a corporation, a school, maybe you're a law office or a medical office that doesn't want a third party to process your mail, this is a great solution. You continue to run your own server. MailRoute just stops the spam before it hits your server. Find out more. Save 10% on the life of your account if you go to mailroute.info. I'm not going to belabor the point. It just works. Mailroute.info, and a special deal for Twit listeners if you go there. We have a long one. This is from Charles Victorian in Houston, Texas, a follow-up on what he learned about frequency hopping spread spectrum, which this sounds like it's apocryphal, but I believe it's true, was invented by Hedy Lamarr, the movie star. Did you know that?
No. No.
Doesn't sound right.
It sure doesn't.
It doesn't sound right.
He's a secret genius.
She was a starlet, a gorgeous woman. Orson Welles dated her for a long time.
I did hear this once somewhere.
She invented spread spectrum. I don't know how. I'd like to know more about this. Frequency. I mean, in Wikipedia talks a little bit about this. It was patented earlier than that. But it says in Wikipedia, the most celebrated invention of frequency hopping was that of actress Hedy Lamarr and composer George Antheil, who in 1942 received a U.S. patent during World War II for their secret communications system. Lamarr had learned at defense meetings that she attended with her former husband, Friedrich Mandel, that radio-guided missile signals could easily be jammed. They used a piano roll to change among 88 different frequencies to make radio-guided torpedoes harder for enemies to detect or jam.
Wow. And
this patent came to life when ITT and other private firms began to develop CDMA, and they did the patent research and said, whoa. Hedy Lamarr owns this.
And 88 keys is the number of keys on a piano.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Others, there's prior art. But independently, Hedy Lamarr thought it up. I think it's fascinating. Steve, thank you so much. Just a historic note. Steve, thank you so much for taking on my question about the Lorex live snap and its use of frequency hopping spread spectrum, or FHSS technology. I was encouraged by your comments on the security which might be implemented by the camera system. He had a baby monitor, I think, right?
Right.
And he didn't want people to watch his camera and his baby. And he said, well, what is this FHSS they say they use? Right. Enough that I not only opened the one I'd already purchased, but went out and bought a second system immediately after hearing the podcast so I could do a little inter-system testing of my own. Now, this is our listeners. This is why I love our listeners. He didn't just say, oh, okay. He said, let me see. Reading over the user's guide, which I previously didn't have access to, explains how to pair up cameras, which gave me hope. The guide states, quote, the cameras included with the monitor have already been paired up with the monitor. So that's why he didn't have to do any configuration with the new one. And it goes on to explain how to pair up additional cameras. Since the base system comes with 2 cameras, yet the monitor supports up to 4. I won't bore you with the details of the relatively simple process, but I will note in particular it requires you to begin with the camera turned off. Additionally, under the tips section, the guide states the camera and monitor should be around a foot apart during the pairing process. So with some confidence gained by your coverage of FHSS on the podcast and a better understanding of how the product works from reading the included user's guide, I tore into the second box. While using a camera and monitor from the first set, I put the second monitor in pair mode. It responded with, quote, pairing, and some symbols indicating to wait. The process exited with, quote, no device found, even though this monitor was as close as I could get to the currently broadcasting camera. They were plugged into separate outlets, and I didn't have an extension cord handy. Nevertheless, any neighbor, etc., is not going to be able to get closer than I was without being inside my house. So it's clear that once the camera is paired to a monitor, another stock monitor can't just show up and receive the signal. Good start. It seems like, as in Bluetooth, the pairing process could leave you vulnerable for a few seconds when you're discoverable, effectively. But then the signal, once it's locked in and paired, should be unaccessible. It also seems that you would know if someone had hijacked your camera, since your monitor would then say no device found. And that would be a clue. I know this doesn't address reverse engineering the system or building some sort of separate hacked monitor, but at least it isn't going to be an easy thing for somebody to drive by, set up a monitor, and watch my baby. Thanks for doing what you do. I always look forward to listening to every episode. I really miss Tech TV, but at least we still have you and Leo. Regards, Charles Victorian. I like that kind of listener.
Well, yes. And the fact that they referred to pairing, of course, that's, the first really great piece of news. Our listeners will probably remember that basically we covered frequency hopping spread spectrum several times relative to Bluetooth. And then when I first entertained Charles' question, he hadn't even opened the box because he wanted to know whether it could be safe enough or whether it was just a scam. And of course, we couldn't answer the question, but I looked at their website and explained what frequency hopping spread spectrum it was. Then that encouraged him to open the box where he found the manual, and then they do take him through a process by which the transmitter and the receiver need to get to know each other, and then he further, as his note indicated, further tested this by taking not only just some random monitor, but the company's same brand of monitor, and tried to see whether it would be able to receive the same signal when it hadn't been paired with the camera, and it wasn't. So again, I think this is just a great example. I wanted to follow up, but also to give our listeners a sense for how you can determine this kind of thing on your own for anything else of this nature in the future.
Yeah, it's a little inductive reasoning, really.
Yeah.
Question 6, Brian Voller in USA, Oregon, Medford. USA.Oregon.Medford. I like how people are identifying themselves. That's great. Planet Earth in the Milky Way. No, solar system, Milky Way in universe. Universe X394.
Now you realize that's how I'm going to get these things sent to me in the future.
From now on. Narrow it down. Hello, guys. Regarding episode 282 and the question about the security of a wireless baby monitor camera that touted frequency hopping as a security mechanism, I would not regard that as effective, particularly in a video transmission context. Being a cheap camera, it's probably sending analog NTSC, which is what, standard definition television in the U.S. is, or EIA, that's a low-quality version of NTSC, and hopping frequency on the completion of each frame, since the vertical blanking interval would make a convenient opportunity to let the tuner lock onto the next frequency. All that makes sense. Individual frames could be captured by scanning the frequency range slowly. Assuming 256 channels, once you found one of them, you'd get one frame every 8.5 seconds. Oh, that's an interesting point.
So, yeah, I thought I saw Brian's question or comment and thought, well, this makes a good companion to the one we just read, and that is to suggest that frequency hopping is not security as he does. And of course, he's right. Frequency hopping is not encryption. It is mostly used to avoid jamming and interference. This is exactly what Hedy Lamarr apparently developed this concept for back in wartime, was not so much for security, but for avoiding interference. The idea being that if one particular frequency is being jammed, you're not going to spend much time there. You'll still be able to get the bulk of your signal through. So I feel, I mean, Brian's point is that if somebody was absolutely determined to monitor this information, what they'd be getting is essentially a very non-standard signal. They wouldn't be getting a video signal. They'd be getting one frame of video, assuming that it's not digitized and it's not encrypted, which we don't know. It could be digitized and encrypted in addition to frequency, the frequency hopping spread spectrum, but they'd be getting one frame on a given frequency, as he said, every 8.5 seconds. But again, you'd have to then capture that and figure out how to display it, because no regular monitor is going to display that. So anyway, I still feel that this makes great security, much more so than just having a video transmitter sending a video out on a single frequency, where, as we know, it's very possible to easily eavesdrop. So yes, not what we would call NSA grade security, right, but you really have to work in order to get a useful picture back out of this thing.
Every 8 seconds.
Yeah. And then you're just getting a frame of data that you then have to go to a lot of work to reconstruct.
Right.
My feeling is if you can't use the manufacturer's own monitor to receive it, then you're pretty much out of luck.
Yeah, that's sufficient.
And that's what our prior questioner verified.
Right. Bill Bolton in Australia raises a great point about IPv6 modem routers. Steve, if the world is going to be forced to move to IPv6 by year's end, why are almost no IP version 6 capable consumer modem routers available as yet? He's talking about when you get a DSL line, often case they'll give you the DSL modem with a built-in router, since they know you're going to hook up a router anyway. There must be well over 100 different models of various makes on the market. I guess it's true also of cable modems, but
exactly, and just other NAT routers.
Yeah, anytime you're getting online, it's not unusual to combine the two. Only 3 of the 100 different makes on the market have the necessary features. It seems more than a little strange to me, with one group crying we're running out of IP addresses, that the manufacturers are saying, huh? Huh? What?
Yeah, I completely agree. Here's another example of it's not going to happen until it has to happen. If you look at NAT routers, they're still IPv4. I've not yet seen one that is supporting IPv6 features. It's just like no one's actually doing it yet. Yet we're running out of space. So it's going to be a really interesting year, Leo.
Yeah. We talked to, at the CES, we had Bob Frankston on. I know you know that name, Bob.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Along with Dan Bricklin, wrote VisiCalc. Actually, Bob did the coding many years ago. Probably, if you were to say there was one application that put personal computing on the map,
yep,
it was that, because initially the Apple II was a toy, and as soon as you put VisiCalc on it, the first spreadsheet program, nobody had written a spreadsheet. Nobody even thought of a digital spreadsheet. As soon as you did that, it was like business was now, okay, now I'm interested. Now I might want to buy one of those things. Anyway, Bob, after his stint at VisiCalc, went to work for Microsoft as a, probably a high-level fellow.
A thinker.
A thinker. And he said, in these days, the ISPs wanted to charge you for each user in the house. And I do remember those days where, you know, basically each one would have a static IP address and you would have to pay the full freight or maybe a slightly discounted rate. He said we were starting to create routers at the time, and it was his suggestion to put NAT in. And he said, I knew, but I didn't tell anyone, that this would effectively make it impossible for ISPs to charge per user. They'd have to charge per household because, of course, the NAT would hide all the additional users. He said, I never mentioned that feature. I just said it'd be a good thing to put NAT in these routers.
and that's what connection sharing is, of course.
Right. And so he says, you know, if you can thank me for the fact that you are paying what you're paying for your internet access. He had some other very interesting things to say. We decided to invite him in for a full-hour interview for our Triangulation show because he's a fascinating guy. And what I like about him, yeah, he created history 40 years ago with VisiCalc. But he's not sat on his laurels, and he's doing something very interesting right now that I really about taking back the internet that I thought was fascinating. He says the net neutrality conversation's misguided. That's not what we need. He said there's a way to handle this.
The other thing, too, is that by putting NAT in all these routers, not only were we preventing ISPs from charging per user, but we did hugely slow down the depletion of the IPv4 address space. Because, you know, we've got, I mean, I'm sure probably all of our listeners have many different machines behind their single IP that's out there, their public IP, and we always are talking about 192.168.x.x addresses, which is, which we're all sharing, but which are kept separate.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you, Bob. Bob Frankston. Aloke Prasad in Ohio has a question for you. He notes that Microsoft disagrees with you about swap files on SSDs. Okay, this I got to see. You said it was unwise to use an SSD for the Windows swap file. You're not alone, by the way. We mentioned Alan Malventano. You talked about your friend, our friend,
Mark Thompson.
Mark Thompson. The following article from Microsoft says otherwise. It's blogs.msdn. It's a 2000.com. It's a 2009, May 2009 article. Support Q&A for solid-state drives. Quote, should the page file be placed on SSDs? Yes. Most page file operations are small random reads or larger sequential writes, both of which are types of operations that SSDs handle well. In looking at telemetry data from thousands of traces and focusing on page file reads and writes, we find that 1. Pagefile.sys reads outnumber pagefile.sys writes by about 40 to 1. Well, that's good to know. That's interesting. So in other words, there's a lot more reading going on than writing. 40 times more. Pagefile.sys read sizes are typically quite small, with 67% less than or equal to 4K, 88% less than 16K. Point 3, pagefile.sys writes are relatively large, with 62% greater than or equal to 128K and 45% being exactly a megabyte in size. This is Windows, of course, only we're talking about. This is how Windows behaves. In fact, given typical page file reference patterns and the favorable performance characteristics SSDs have on those patterns, in other words, SSDs are faster with reads. They're really great with lots of small reads because the seek time is 0. There are a few files better than the page file to place on an SSD. Well, that kind of makes sense. The issue really more is this thrashing of the SSD. But if the files are megabyte most of the time, does that ameliorate that?
Well, this is a perfect example of a person answering a question from their perspective, but not a different perspective. That is, if all you were asking was about performance, then I completely agree. But my focus has never been on performance in this discussion. It's been on burning the things out, which this doesn't address at all.
So all of those extra writes, regardless of the size of the writes, are not good.
Correct.
Reads we don't care about on an SSD. Lots of reading we don't care about. It's the writing we care about.
Correct, because writing is a physically fatiguing process for an SSD.
You say that again.
Yeah.
As the author of 13 books. No, I'm just kidding. Never do it again.
And Mark Thompson and I've discussed this at length. He's performed the experiment of using an SSD for a swap file and watching it burn out the SSD. I mean, in a relatively short time, it just killed it. And so, anyway, so my advice stands, which is if you're using an SSD, hopefully before you have gone to the expense of using an SSD, which is still much more expensive than a hard drive, you will have invested money in as much RAM as your system can handle. Because RAM is much less expensive, and you'll get much more benefit. You'll get a huge benefit from going to the most RAM you can possibly get. And if you've done that, then turn off page files. And if the only drive you have is an SSD, I stand by my advice. I agree that from a performance standpoint, the SSD is a perfect device for containing the page file. Unfortunately, Microsoft thrashes their page file. I mean, they're writing to it a lot. Yes, 40 times less than they're reading, but it's something that's going on all the time, pretty much. I mean, we've all seen it. You know, we've watched the hard drive light flickering there, like when nothing is going on. It's like, what is it doing? Well, who knows? But we know that it's writing to the page file, which it does a lot. So anyway, I think it's a perfect example of two different people with very different aspects of the problem that they're addressing. I'm looking at long-term life. Microsoft's looking at performance.
That's really great. What a great illustration of that. Depending on your point of view. I love that. Yeah. So we stand by our suggestion not to use the SSD for the page file unless you don't mind buying SSDs regularly.
Yeah, right. They're cheap.
It will be faster, though. It will speed it up. Well, could you put a page file in a RAM disk? I guess you could. That would be a good thing to do.
Well, it would make much more sense to leave that RAM disk free for RAM.
Well, yeah, right, of course. The more RAM you have, the less you need a page file. Page file is all about what happens when you run out of RAM.
But if you had a RAM-based hard drive, that is, if you had a RAM-based, physical drive that wasn't part of main memory and couldn't be part of main memory, then so that it's like a separate paging device, then absolutely, that would make a lot of sense.
Our last question, Stephen, from Jim Sanders in Irvine, California. He wonders about iPod and iPad solid-state hard drives. Because most iPods, only one, the Classic, has a moving drive. And all the iPads are solid-state. In fact, the MacBook Airs are also solid-state. Steve, you talked about the finite number of write cycles on solid-state hard drives, which I presume includes the array of portable devices like the solid-state iPod and the iPads. Given that, should we be thinking about minimizing the number of times we sync the devices? Does syncing with the desktop shorten the lifespan of the SS hard drive? Longtime Spinrite owner, save two machines for me. Sorry.
One of the things that I thought I should do, I like this question because I think maybe I've concerned people unnecessarily. The least robust technology for SSDs is called the MLC, the multi-level cell, as opposed to the SLC, the single-level cell, which is much more expensive drive, but also more robust. But even the multi-level cell, the lesser of the two technologies in terms of robustness, has a guaranteed minimum number of write cycles of about 10,000. Now, I just divided 10,000 by 365, which is roughly the number of days in a year. And I get 27.397, which is to say that if you rewrote the entire drive daily, that drive would last for a minimum of 27.397 years. So, yes, SSDs have a limited life. But so does the universe.
In a nutshell. What can you do?
So don't worry about it.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I like it. Steve, you're always, I love this show, and I actually love the Q&As because of the wide range of topics. I know it's fun to drill deep into a subject, as we did last week with Bluetooth hacking, but it's also fun just to cover a wide range of topics. I always learn so much on this show, and I thank you for it. Do you know yet what we're going to do next week?
We're going to talk about fuzzing, fuzzy wuzzy, browser fuzzing. It's the work that was done recently by the Google security researcher who, using fuzzing, found interesting and in many cases significant problems, more than 100, with all of the browsers we're currently using. So we're going to talk about fuzzing, a different approach to finding security vulnerabilities.
I love it. Next week on Security Now. Meanwhile, if you want 16 kilobit versions of this show for the bandwidth impaired, if you want full transcripts and show notes, you can go to grc.com. That's Steve's site. While you're there, don't forget to take a look at Spinrite, the world's finest hard drive maintenance and recovery utility not for SSDs, for spinning drives. You're going to have to come up with something for SSDs, Steve. I hope you're thinking about that.
I'm thinking about it, actually.
Yeah, that should be an interesting challenge. Also, lots of free stuff. Shields Up, Decombobulator, Don't Shoot the Messenger, just a ton of, actually shoot the messenger, kill it dead. And tons of great stuff that Steve just does out of the goodness of his heart and because he loves to write software and assembly code. You can find that all at grc.com. You can also watch this show. We do it live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern Time at live.twit.tv, or subscribe. You really ought to, because in fact, you ought to go back and listen to all 284 episodes, because it's a graduate degree in computers and how they work. That's at twit.tv/SN for Security Now. Steve, have a great week.
Will do, Leo. Thanks very much.
See you next week right here.
Security Now.